Hello, super scholars of EDUC 2400. I am getting ready to open up week 4 module for you, and so I was working on the overview page and the overview PowerPoint, and I thought, let me just see if I can make a little recording and talk through some of the things which might be a little easier than trying to type them all out. I know asynchronous classes are so heavily student directed and dependent on you wading through a ton of text. So I thought I'll try my hand at making a little video to introduce this week's module for you. We're starting Monday, January 31st on our week 4 module. So I'm looking at our tentative schedule here in the syllabus on page 19, and it says week 4, culture, identity, and learning. Okay, so we have been working so far in our class on issues that have a lot to do with the socio-political context of schooling. And that makes sense, right? Because our class is called School, Society, and Diversity. So we know that those three things, schools, society, and diversity, are important factors that we're trying to understand. How do they go together? Because for us as educators and future educators, we want to go into schools and learning contexts, and we're interested in being dream keepers, not dream wreckers. I really have rarely met the person who goes, yes, I want to be a dream wrecker. So we also know that historically, the relationship between school, society, and diversity has not been a positive one. There have been patterns of exclusion and disparities in educational opportunities, experiences, outcomes. Some people have called it the achievement gap, but we know that it's really more of an achievement debt. And what that means is that the way that schools have come together, schools, society, and diversity have historically worked in the United States, is that they have come together to push certain groups and populations away from benefiting fully from the opportunities of schooling. And of course, we are in a republic, which means that the citizens are part of the decision making, the old we the people. But unfortunately, the we was pretty limited when our nation was founded. And so we've always kind of been struggling historically to push the boundaries of who is in the we group. And when it started out, it wasn't even all white men, it was land owning white men. So, this whole idea of schooling then was that if you were going to have an informed population or citizenry making decisions, you had to educate them, and what was supposed to kind of equalize the very different backgrounds that people brought in access to learning and being literate. Schools were supposed to do that. And if you know anything about the history of schooling, it started out with very few requirements for schooling, and only few had access to it. 3 years, that was considered fine for the common schools. They weren't called public schools at first. So my point in talking about that is that historically, we've had this relationship between schools, society, and diversity, and it hasn't worked well. But we're in this nation where we say that we believe about equal opportunity and we care about fairness, and we care about democracy and people having the opportunity to fully participate. And schooling is about that. So, so we kind of take it as a given that school, society, and diversity should not equal disparities and educational inequities. So, who is the kind of key factor to break that historical tradition of school, society, and diversity being about exclusion and inequity? We know that teachers make the difference. Teachers are where the rubber hits the road. Um, in a lot of situations where you have learners and communities that more closely reflect the mainstream of U.S. society, a lot of times it isn't so critical what the teacher does or doesn't do, because there might be a lot of opportunities outside of school where if you get a bad teacher, if you have a bad schooling experience, the parents and community often can compensate for that, and so they'll bounce back from a bad teacher fairly easily. But in other communities where the families and the children and youth are facing the negative consequences of, say, poverty, there's a lot that goes on with trying to deal with poverty. So when you have families and learners trying to face the effects of poverty, that can, really interrupt what is possible and what kind of opportunities and experiences happen for learners and their families, even though they do care about education and so on. So, one of the things that I have really tried to work hard with everybody that I interact and collaborate with, whether they're future teachers, whether they're community members, or whomever they are, I've always tried to be of the mindset I can control me, and sometimes I do, kind of an iffy job on that. But the one person that I have really a lot of ability to determine what happens is me and in my sphere of influence. I don't have a lot of ability. I can suggest, I can inquire, I can do various reach out sort of things with other people, but I'm in charge of me for the most part. So, if I have students, for example, that maybe their parents are selling drugs or selling stolen car parts or whatever, uh, yeah, I don't have full control over that. I may or may not agree with that. I might think that's morally wrong or whatever, but I don't really have any control over that. What I have control over is me. And so when my students come into the classroom, be they adults or be they children or, youth, high schoolers, elderly, I've worked with students who are much older than me and much younger than me, taught kindergarten and preschool. Regardless, when they come into my classroom, I'm the one who is reflecting kind of the institutional authority, and I'm the one who is in the position of determining more so what happens in the classroom than the students are. So even though you, for example, are adults and you have a lot of autonomy and you know what's happening in your life and you know what's best for you and you know how to make good decisions for yourself, you and I are still in this unequal relationship where I determine your grades. And even though you will write a course evaluation on me, I'm still the one, like when the buck stops, it generally stops with me. So your position is a little more muted than mine. When you go into your own classrooms or maybe your own homes or something, it might be tipped in another direction where you have more say so, and the institutions might reflect more of what you say. So, my point being that In my classroom, I control and I have a great deal of autonomy over what's happening. And therefore, what's happening outside of my classroom, I don't necessarily have as much control. And nor do I have the moral authority to implement a lot of things there. So, what I want to do is teach regardless. So, let's say Jamal comes to my class and I learn that Jamal's father, grandfather, uncles, they're all incarcerated. Well, Jamal's here. So I have to teach Jamal, So some teachers will give a lot of excuses about, well, these kids come from poor families or they come from a poor neighborhood or, whatever. Those are simply excuses not to teach. And so I have control over me and I have to teach. And the reason that I'm kind of making a big deal about this is because our focus now in our class, we're going to start shifting a little bit away from the schools and diversity and society, which is the context of it that we were born into and are entering our profession in. And we're going to start looking a little more micro interactions at teacher student interactions and what that looks like. So, for our first 3 weeks of class, we've been focusing on kind of this big picture of what happens historically with schools, society, and diversity. And that's the socio-political context of schooling. And we know it hasn't historically worked well. So now we're bringing the lens in a little closer and we're going to start looking a little bit closer, zoomed in a little bit on the individuals and groups and look at culture and identity. So a lot of times when people think about culture, they think about, piñatas, they think about quinceañeras, they think about, Mardi Gras, they think about, do-rags, they think about all kinds of things that kind of are these external manifestations that groups have established over time, and those are important, no doubt, but culture is really much deeper than that. And many of you may have been outside of the United States, and so you may have experienced this firsthand, where once you went out of the United States, you really got a sense of what your own culture was because you were starting to experience another culture. I know when I lived in South America, I really saw my own culture from being in the United States in the sense that I was used to much more personal space. In the United States, we have a little bit more personal space than they did where I was in Argentina. And so I really felt uncomfortable a lot of times because, I just felt like people were so in my personal space, and there was always a lot of kissing going on. There was kissing to enter the room, there was kissing to go out when you were departing, and so on. So my personal space, even though I tend to be a very affectionate, warm, outward person, I was really a little bit uncomfortable with that, and it took me some getting used to it. But what I was learning was what were the norms that I was used to and considered normal as compared to another place. So, the important thing about culture is that it's not just, oh, that's so nice, that it's like this buffet and you look at all the food and you say, I'll take some of this and I'll take some of that, and this is lovely and this is lovely. And so that sort of an understanding is fine, but that's not what we're talking about in schools, diversity, and society. What we're talking about is these cultural norms tend to be differentially valued. So pay close attention when you're reading this week. You may come across the term cultural pluralism. And what that means is kind of this buffet of differences. And we're just like, it's a boutique of differences. It's just lovely. Well, these people are like this and these people are like that. And it's lovely. So think for a moment, if you have familiarity with the Judeo-Christian traditions, the Roman Empire during the lifetime of the prophet Jesus Christ. Okay, I'm talking about the Judeo-Christian tradition. And during that time, the Roman Empire had lots of diversity. And so there was a lot of differences that were accepted. But don't get it twisted, right? When the Romans decided that it was time to lay down the law, they laid down the law. So the difference was fine until it wasn't. And so with cultural pluralism, the idea is that all differences are equally valued. And we know that's not true because, we see that when we're looking classrooms and we see, well, English as the language of instruction and Spanish. If you are already a primary speaker of English and you're adding Spanish as a second language, for example, could be another language, that is much higher status than if you are a primary speaker of Spanish and you're adding English as a second language. The idea is that you better learn English. We're not really concerned about whether you keep Spanish or not. And so I'm not saying you think that. I'm saying that in our country, we've had historically English only movements. We've had all kinds of things. So whether you personally believe it or not, those have been norms in our society, regardless of what you believe. So I know that many of you do not believe that, but that's still true of our society. So you see the unequal valuing of cultural norms and characteristics. So think about that as you're reading this week. The other thing that I really want you to know as you're thinking about culture this week, a lot of people, it's so stereotypical for them. They don't know how to think about culture as anything except like quinceañeras and food, fun, and fiesta sorts of things. And those are fun, definitely, but that's not the real essence of what plays out in schools. So for example, when somebody says something like, "Woo, those girls are too loud." As soon as they said too loud, it means that there's an understanding of what girls are supposed to sound like and look like and act like, and they've gone too. So they've gone above that norm. So they're being policed back in. And we know that girls tend to be encouraged to be very passive, very quiet, where boys are often encouraged to be very active. And there's things about, well, boys will be boys and so on. So these are like deeper norms that our culture kind of tells us what is good, true, and beautiful. And we learn these whether we realize it or not. And in fact, we don't even know it until somebody breaks the rule. We just go around in our daily life and we're not even thinking about it till somebody breaks it. And then we're like, whoops. Okay, so for example, here's an example of that for religious differences. My husband and I are Roman Catholics, and I'm actually a convert. And so I had to learn how to be Catholic. And so if you see somebody in a Catholic church and they put their arm up on the bench like this, right away, the people who are Catholic, who are maybe cradle Catholics, if you will, that's a term, that they will immediately recognize that as, we don't do that. Protestants do that, but Catholics do not. And so it's not until the people break those norms that it suddenly becomes clear what our culture is. So now, to bring that back to our school, society, and diversity, and these educational inequities that we're trying to challenge, if I'm the school teacher and I'm not aware of how my culture acts as this pair of glasses for me that tells me what is good, true, and beautiful, when I see Jamal jumping up and down and around, my cultural lens might say to me, ooh, potentially this one could turn into a thug. And we know that that happens whether people are intentionally doing it or not. Because how do I know? Because I look at the discipline trends in discipline. Who gets expelled? Who gets sent to the whatever the retrack or whatever the after school program is for the room for the naughty children. So they call them by different names in different schools. But whatever it is, we know that it's the kids of color, that especially the boys, that tend to be funneled that way more often. So is it really possible that they're that much naughtier than the other kids? Or is it maybe the lens that we're looking at? I've done a lot of research on adoption, and we look at how the rates of how children are taken out of the home. And Black children will be taken out of the home at 400 times the rate of white children. Now, is this because white parents are so much better? No, it's just, you've got bad parents on pretty much in every group, unfortunately. But the rates aren't necessarily that different. It's just who gets their children taken out. So when the professionals are going in, they're putting on their cultural lenses and they're looking at the behavior and the interactions, and they're using their own norms to put it on other people. So as a teacher, there's real consequences for that. You might say, well, Shaniqua doesn't look like a leader. Well, what does that mean? There's cultural norms behind what we think about as a leader. But if we're learning to think about that, then that's what we can become aware of that and pay attention to it and kind of watch for what's happening. Have you heard of that, like metacognitive, where you're thinking about your thinking? And that you can learn to do that. You can learn to ask questions of yourself. Now, is this the reason that I'm doing that? And I have had to do that sometimes. As a third grade teacher, I had a student whom the second grade teacher told me was just a handful. And, I was like, I'm going to keep my good eye on this one. And I didn't have any problem, but it plagued me the whole year, where it was like I was just waiting for this little man to act out. And, I really had to watch myself, like, why am I just like so ready to pounce? I had been so influenced by another teacher's assessment that I wasn't giving this child his room. He needed to be his own person. But I could think about that and watch myself and try to catch myself by being aware of my thinking and what my own norms are. So I want to kind of close this little introduction, and I hope this is kind of getting you excited about the next turn that we're going to go in our course. So the first 3 weeks we've been kind of looking at these historical, political contexts that have been in place long before you were born, long before I was born. And these things have been put in place over the generations, and they have meant that certain groups of children have benefited much more from schooling and other children and groups have not. And so if we say, well, we care, actually, we do believe that all children can learn and that our job is really to teach all children, be successful with all children, then we really have to pay attention to that. Because people will look at these disparities and they'll look at them, they'll say, well, how is it possible that this educational debt exists? Well, who did it? And they're looking around and they're like, who did it? Is it you? You? Who did it? And it's not really about who did it. It's about how are we participating in these ways of acting and interacting and making decisions in classrooms where, who is the enemy? Well, the enemy is ourselves. Not that we're enemies, but just in the sense that, it's not looking over your shoulder and say, who did this? It's about what's happening in my classroom. How can I rethink things? How can I stop? How can I say, what's going on here? What's happening? If you listen to students, as hard as it can be, a lot of times they do tell you very informative things. Whether they're adults as you are, I do try to listen to you, even though we're in this asynchronous, digitally mediated context. I try to hear you, even from your silences. I try to listen. What is going on with them? How are they feeling? And, some people are like, we're adults, don't be such a helicopter. And I appreciate that. And I hear that. And I know I need to respect you for that. At the same time, I want you to be successful and I want to know how I can help you be successful. So we can all do that. As we go into our spaces, we can say, who is included, who isn't, what's going on, why is it so? Usually these things were in place long before you and I got here. So what can be done? Now, I'll close by sharing with you a little story about a girl. And I think you've read this little story. I forget. I teach a lot of classes in a lot of semesters, so I forget, but I believe you have. And it's the butterflies story where the little girl is in the classroom and her teacher asks her to draw a story of, what they were doing at home or something like that. It was a journal entry. So the little girl, she's clearly not from a mainstream background family. She isn't raised in a two-parent, a middle-class home. Her grandparents are raising her. Her English doesn't sound like it's a primary English-speaking family. They're in the country because the grandparents do raise crops. And so cabbages. And so when the teacher asked the children to write a story, draw a picture of something that they were doing, this little girl, she draws a picture of herself and she is killing the butterflies. And so she brings her story up to the teacher, and the teacher says, what's going on here? Well, this is me and I'm killing the butterflies. And the teacher only says to her, butterflies are beautiful. We don't kill them. So the little girl, then she goes back to her desk. Okay. And then she goes home and her grandparents are waiting to greet her as she gets off of the bus. And her grandmother says to her, so, what did you do? How did your day go? And the little girl tells her, well, I wrote a story. And the grandfather says, did she like your story? And the little girl hesitates and she doesn't say anything. And the grandmother says, what was your story about? And the little girl says, I killed the butterflies. And so the grandparents don't say anything for a while, and then in a little while the grandfather says, well, your teacher, she buys her cabbages at the grocery store. Now, that's a powerful ending to that story. And sometimes people miss the power of that ending. And what it is you see the teacher's identity is colliding big time with the child's identity and the identities of the community members, specifically her grandparents and the community that she comes from. So this little girl, the grandfather told her, your teacher, she buys her cabbages at the grocery store. So she doesn't know that butterflies will kill your cabbage crop. So the little girl's coming from a community that's rural that knows, well, if we don't raise cabbages, we don't have any money. So for us, butterflies are a pest that need to be killed. But again, going back to that unequal valuing of cultures, it's not like the little girl's culture is just as important as the teacher's, because the teacher doesn't even know this. She clearly doesn't, because she tells the child, we don't kill butterflies. So the child now, she can't say, oh, yes, we can. Yes, we do kill butterflies. Oh, she can say that all right. And then the teacher's going to think she's smart-mouthing her and be like, excuse me? And, she may be written up, or the teacher might be thinking, this child comes from a family that's got no home training. There's all kinds of things that could start snowballing out of control here. So the little girl has kind of two options, because her teacher is taking it as normal that butterflies are beautiful. She's not necessarily intentionally being harmful to the child, but she is being harmful because the little girl is getting a message here from her teacher. I know that we kill butterflies. So she's got two options as a student. She can say, I know we kill butterflies, and I don't care what you say, teacher. I know we do. And so she can be resistant, and she can hold the line, and she can say, this is my story and I'm sticking to it. And we have retrack in other places for naughty students like that. Eventually this is going to cause such a collision, and there's not going to be a lot of learning going on. Or the little girl could say, shoot, my teacher's story. Now that's a story. I value my teacher. My teacher is the one, I need to be like her. She's the one who says so. So my story must be wrong. My story must be bad. In fact, not only is my story wrong and bad, but my grandparents must be bad too, since they have the same story and they told me this. And my community must be bad. So that means we're all bad. So I don't want to be like them anymore. I want to be like my teacher. I want my teacher's story. So she's going to shed her own identity and say, I want to be like the teacher. So that's a very subtractive form of schooling. I'm going to try to get rid of my identity, and I'm going to try to be you. But of course I can't be you because I'm me. And so, this is just a lose-lose battle no matter which way it goes. If she's like, I'm proud of my background, I'm sticking to it. I don't care how much you tell me my story is wrong. I know it's not. There's consequences for that. If I say, well, fine, I'm going to run with your story. I'm going to get rid of my story and my people. That kind of subtractive schooling is also a big problem. So you can kind of see here how it isn't necessarily about who did this, who's the bad person. We need to get rid of you. It's very good people who end up perpetuating these things. But if you and I, if we understand our own identity as teachers, and we understand our students' identities, we can find bridges. You don't have to be like me. I don't have to be like you. I can reach out and connect with you. I can value you without having to be you. And you can value me without having to be me. And we know we can try to see, like, I am responsible since I am your teacher. I need to be responsible for keep creating a space where you feel safe to actually speak, so that you don't feel like repercussions are going to come down on your head and you're going to get a bad grade or something like that. I'm the one who has to control that because I am the one who has the more institutional authority here. So you can do that for your students too. You can take the lead and say, what's going on here? When you walk into the classroom, you walk in with your body. And so people look at you and they're coming from a long history. They might not know you personally, and they're like, oh, I've had bad experiences with people like that. I have that happen to me all the time because I live in a community and a context where there's very few white people. And hence, when I walk in the door, it's usually a signal of bad news. I don't take it personally. I do not. I've learned to kind of develop kind of a tough outer skin. And sometimes, yes, my feelings get hurt. But at the same time, I try to be patient. I try to, understand the historical things that have happened. For example, my husband is black. And so a lot of times, there will be people around, both white and black, who don't like to see a biracial couple like that. I try to be very patient with whatever it is because, they do have their rights to their own thoughts. And I know that there's a long history of black men being murdered and mutilated and all kinds of things for associating with white women. So I'm very patient about women of color being very suspicious of me. With white people, when they look at me and they're very suspicious of me, I understand. Our groups have policed us to stay within our group. So I understand my identity, that when I walk into the room, what you see is my identity. You might not know that maybe I identify more as a professor. You don't see that on my body. You might not know a lot of things that I really identify with until you get to know me a little bit better. But you sure do see my body, and I see yours, and that's like a shorthand. Have you ever been in a situation where you don't know if the person you're speaking to is a man or a woman? That you have kind of like a little mini crisis because our society has taught us that you interact with men in a certain way and you interact with women in a certain way. So if I'm not really clear, quote, what you are as far as your gender, I'm a little bit I'm looking for clues. What is it? Is it your hair? Is it your body shape? What? I mean, those can all be, kind of mixed clues, mixed messages there. So I'm a little concerned. But identity is a shorthand way for us to kind of be able to make connections and connect with each other. And our society has done that for us, where they've said, well, when you run into this group, think about that. So we know it's much more complex with that. And so we can be aware of our thinking, and we can say, let me give a little bit of space there, especially when we're thinking about schools, society, and diversity, because what you do as a professional can really make or break the educational outcomes and contribute to those educational debts or work against them. So I hope you enjoy this module's interactions. I've really been trying to cut it down so that you're not feeling so overwhelmed. Reach out to me and just know that I'm here for you, and I enjoy interacting with you. Okay, and thank you.